Elliot Kane thought he'd buried his past in the Arizona desert. He was wrong. 8 years. That's how long he'd been running. 8 years since Wolf Pass, since the screams, since a frozen moment of hesitation cost a boy his life. 8 years alone in a ranch that creaked like old bones, surrounded by nothing but silence and stars and the weight of what he'd done. Some men drink to forget. Elliot chose solitude, but the desert doesn't let you forget. It only makes you wait. That night changed everything. She came out of the darkness like a fever dream. One moment the desert was empty. The next, a silhouette swayed toward his porch, collapsing against the moonlight. Her name was Neol. He didn't know it yet, but that name would burn itself into his soul before sunrise. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, clinging to sweat-damp skin. Dark eyes locked onto his, not pleading, but challenging, defiant. When she collapsed, her hand grazed his, and the touch sent electricity through his calloused fingers. He caught her, carried her inside, laid her on his cot, forcing himself to look away from the torn dress, the exposed skin, the mystery wrapped in trouble. Then he heard it. Hooves. Pounding the earth like war drums, Silas Creed was coming, and Elliot Kane's 8 years of peace were about to end in blood. If you want to know how far this goes, hit that subscribe button right now. You're not ready for what's coming next. The dawn bled red across the horizon, and with it came the past Elliot thought he'd escaped. Neol stirred on the cot, breathing steady but shallow. Elliot stood at the window, knuckles white against the frame, remembering the touch of her skin from the night before. A fleeting graze that had unraveled something inside him he'd buried years ago. He'd fought wars, buried comrades, watched good men die for bad reasons. But nothing had shaken him like the wildfire in this woman's eyes. The thunder wasn't from the sky, it was from the earth itself. Silas Creed rode at the head of 6 soldiers, his face carved from cruelty and arrogance. Behind him, roped like cattle, trudged a line of Apache prisoners. Their faces showed defiance even through exhaustion. Elliot's gut twisted. This wasn't just any patrol. Creed wasn't just any soldier. He was the man Elliot had reported for slaughtering civilians at Wolf Pass. The man who'd lost his rank because Elliot chose honor over loyalty. The man who'd been hunting Elliot ever since. And now, he'd found him. Creed dismounted, spurs jingling like a death rattle. "Still hidin', Kane?" His voice was gravel scraping stone. "Thought you'd be dust by now, after Wolf Pass." The words sliced open old wounds. Elliot said nothing, but his eyes flicked to Neol, now standing in the cabin doorway. Her torn dress hung loose, framing the curve of her hip against the dim interior light. Her posture screamed defiance, but her chest rose and fell too quickly. She was afraid. And Elliot's blood surged with a primal need to protect her. Creed's gaze followed Elliot's. His smirk widened, predatory and cruel. "Found yourself a stray, huh?" He yanked an Apache prisoner forward, a boy barely 20, and shoved him toward the water trough. "Thirsty, savage?" His eyes never left Elliot, daring him to act. Neol's knuckles went white on the doorframe. Elliot felt her presence like a pulse, pulling at the part of him he'd buried for 8 years. The part that gave a damn. The part that got people killed at Wolf Pass. He couldn't stand by. Not again. In a flash, Elliot kicked the water bucket. It crashed to the ground, spilling everywhere. Creed's horse reared, hooves slashing air. Chaos erupted, soldiers cursing, horses stumbling, prisoners scattering. Neol moved like liquid fire. She grabbed a jagged rock and sliced through the ropes binding the young prisoner, then darted toward the canyons beyond the ranch. Elliot's breath caught as he watched her flee, the torn hem of her dress flashing in the sunlight. Creed roared with rage, spurring his men after her. But the jagged terrain swallowed Neol like a shadow. She was gone. And Elliot stood alone in the settling dust, knowing he'd just painted a target on his own back. Creed's parting glare promised blood, The ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Inside, Elliot's mind raced. Neil was out there, wounded and hunted, and he'd just crossed a man who'd burn the world to win. But it was her fire that made him realize something terrifying. He couldn't be a ghost anymore. The canyons swallowed the sun, cloaking the world in star-dusted black. Elliot Kane moved through darkness like a shadow, boots silent on rocky ground. He'd spent 8 years mapping this desert in solitude. Now that knowledge had a purpose. Neil was out there, wounded, hunted. The memory of her in his cabin gnawed at him, her skin cool under his touch, her eyes burning with unspoken fire. This wasn't just desire. It was hunger to protect something he couldn't name. A pull that threatened to unravel every wall he'd built around his shattered heart. He followed her trail. A dislodged pebble, a broken twig, a faint smear of blood on pale stone. Each sign whispered her struggle. Each one called him deeper into the night. Hours passed in cold desert air until he found her beneath a granite overhang, curled tight against stone. She looked impossibly small, her torn dress clinging to her frame. Elliot knelt beside her, his hand hovering, hesitant. He hadn't touched another soul in years. "Easy now," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Slowly, he brushed matted hair from her face. Her skin was soft but fever-warm. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wild, locking onto his with a fierceness that sent shivers down his spine. Time stilled. Her breath caught, her lips parted slightly. The air between them grew thick with unspoken tension. Elliot's pulse quickened, a forbidden urge to lean closer warring with the guilt that anchored him. He pulled back, jaw tight, focusing on her wound instead. He lifted her, her body light but heavy with pain, and carried her back to the cabin. Every step was a battle against thorns that tore his clothes, and the heat of her pressed against him. Inside, he laid her on the cot. The oil lamp cast long shadows across her face. As he cut away blood-crusted fabric to clean her shoulder wound, a small deerskin pouch slipped from her dress, landing with a soft thud. He reached for it. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "No," she whispered, her voice raw, her eyes blazing with protectiveness that humbled him. The touch lingered. Her fingers were warm against his skin, stirring something deep and dangerous within him. He nodded, raising his hands in peace, and returned to his task, dabbing the wound with deliberate care to earn her trust. As he bandaged her, Neil's breathing steadied. She pointed to her chest. "Neil," she said clearly despite the pain. "Elliot," he replied, the name feeling foreign on his tongue after years of silence. She clutched the pouch, loosening its drawstring to reveal midnight blue, fiery red, and speckled white corn kernels. Her broken English wove a story of a village burned by Silas Creed, her people scattered like ash. These seeds were their future, meant for a northern valley where they could grow again. Her eyes, fierce yet vulnerable, met his. Elliot saw not just a survivor, but a guardian carrying a legacy. The weight of her mission settled on him. A spark reignited the man he'd buried after Wolf Pass. But Neil wasn't done. "Your law," she said, her voice steady now. "It binds. If I am your wife, he cannot take me." The words hit Elliot like a bullet. A marriage of convenience. A desperate gambit to shield her from Creed's wrath. He stared at her, the lamp's glow tracing the defiant tilt of her chin, the soft curve of her neck. The idea was madness. Yet it stirred a reckless hope. A chance to protect her, to rewrite his failures. But it also meant stepping back into a world of violence he'd sworn to leave behind. His gaze dropped to the pouch, then back to her eyes, where a silent vow was forming. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the distant echo of hooves. Creed was closing in. Time was running out. And Elliot Kane had a choice to make. The Arizona night pressed against the cabin walls like a restless beast. Inside, Elliot Kane stood over a small wooden box, his fingers tracing worn edges where he'd kept his past locked away. Neol's words echoed in his mind. A marriage. A lie to bind her to him under the white man's law. A shield against Silas Creed's wrath. It was madness. Yet her fire, her unyielding will, had cracked the stone around his heart. He opened the box, lifted a silver ring. Its faint gleam was a ghost of his late wife's laughter. The weight of it burned his palm. A promise he wasn't sure he could keep again. Neol stood by the hearth, her silhouette sharp against flickering flames. Her dress, patched now, hugged her frame. She turned, catching his gaze, her dark eyes holding a storm of defiance and something softer. Trust, fragile as a desert bloom. "You do this, Elliot," she said, her voice low. "We fight together." Her words were a vow. She stepped closer, bare feet silent on the floor, stopping just short of touching him. The space between them crackled, electric. Her presence pulled at him like a tide. Elliot's chest tightened, his fingers curled around the ring. A war raged inside him between the urge to close the distance and the guilt that chained him to his past. He nodded, swallowing hard, and held out the ring. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, a fleeting spark that sent his blood racing. For a moment, their eyes locked. Her lips parted slightly. He wondered how close a man could stand to a flame before he burned. The ceremony was quick, words muttered under the weight of necessity. Elliot slipped the ring onto her finger, his calloused hand steady, but his heart unsteady. Neol's hand trembled faintly, her skin warm against his. A quiet intimacy that felt more real than the lie they were weaving. They stood there, bound by a fragile pact. Then the door crashed open. Silas Creed stormed in, spurs clanging, soldiers fanning out like wolves. His eyes, cold and vicious, flicked from Elliot to Neol, lingering on her with a hunger that made Elliot's fists clench. "A wedding?" Creed sneered, his voice dripping venom. "You think a ring makes her yours, Kane? She's a fugitive and you're a traitor." He stepped forward, his hand on his revolver. The air grew thick with the promise of blood. Neol stood tall, chin lifted, chest rising under thin fabric, but her eyes remained unyielding. Elliot stepped between them, his voice low and deadly. "She's my wife, Creed. Touch her, and you're a dead man." Creed laughed, a cruel bark, and raised his gun. The moment hung like a noose, taut and unforgiving. Then Elliot moved, not for his own weapon, but for the table. He shoved it hard, sending it crashing into Creed's men. The oil lamp atop it shattered. Flames licked the floor, smoke curled like a serpent. Neol darted forward, swift as lightning, grabbing a soldier's knife from his belt and slashing the ropes binding a chair. She tossed it to Elliot. Their eyes met for a split second. Shared resolve. Silent trust. Elliot fired a shot into the ceiling. The crack was deafening. Neol slipped through the chaos, her form a blur toward the open door. Creed roared, lunging after her, but Neol was already gone, leading him into the canyons. Elliot followed, his heart pounding, knowing her plan. She lured Creed into a narrow gorge, her footsteps light, her silhouette a taunt against moonlit rock. Elliot climbed the ridge above, muscles burning. He found the loose boulders he'd mapped years ago. With a grunt, he pushed. A cascade of stone thundered down. Creed's scream was swallowed by dust. His men scattered as the canyon sealed him in a tomb of his own making. Elliot slid down the slope, finding Neol leaning against a rock, breath ragged but triumphant. Her eyes met his. A spark of victory mingled with exhaustion. For a moment, the world was just them. Two souls who'd outrun death, bound by more than a ring. But the story doesn't end there, because what Elliot didn't know was that Creed had a brother, and he was already on his way. The Arizona dawn broke soft over the canyons, painting rocks in hues of gold and blood. Elliot Kane stood outside his cabin, its weathered walls no longer a refuge but a relic of a man he'd left behind. Neal emerged from the doorway, her deerskin pouch clutched tight. The seeds within were a promise of life beyond the ash of her village. Her dress, patched but proud, swayed against her frame. Morning light traced the curve of her cheek. She glanced at Elliot, her dark eyes steady. No longer a wildfire, but a hearth, warm, enduring. A fleeting spark passed between them. Her lips curved in a quiet challenge that stirred his heart one last time. He turned away, chest tight, knowing desire had no place where duty called. Neal unfolded a tattered map, its lines leading to a northern valley where her people's seeds could take root. "This is my path," she said, her voice clear, a vow to her ancestors. Elliot looked at the horizon, then back at the cabin. 8 years of ghosts, of Wolf Pass, of a boy's blood on his hands. He'd run from life once, but Neal's fire had burned that fear to ash. "It's our path," he corrected, his voice low but firm. She nodded, the silent bond forged not by rings or laws, but by shared scars and stubborn hope. They saddled 2 horses. The cabin shrank behind them as they rode north. The desert stretched vast and unforgiving, but Elliot felt lighter than he had in years. Neal rode beside him, her posture fierce, her hair catching the wind like a banner of defiance. Together, they carried more than seeds. They carried redemption, a chance to plant something new in a world that had tried to break them. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Elliot had faced his past. Neal had faced her loss. And in their union, they found strength, not in violence, but in purpose. The valley awaited, a dream worth fighting for. But as they crested the first ridge, Elliot saw dust rising on the horizon behind them. Riders, at least a dozen, moving fast. He glanced at Neal. She'd seen them too. Her jaw set with determination. "Creed's brother," Elliot said quietly. "He'll want revenge." Neal's hand moved to the knife at her belt. "Then we give him a fight." They rode harder. The northern valley was still 3 days away. The riders were closing the gap. By nightfall, they'd be in rifle range. Elliot knew these canyons better than anyone, but Creed's brother would have trackers. Apache scouts forced to work for the army. Men who could read the desert like a book. Neal leaned forward in her saddle, urging her horse faster. The deerskin pouch bounced against her chest. Those seeds were everything, the future of her people. The reason for this mad ride north. They couldn't let Creed's brother take them. As the sun climbed higher, Elliot made a decision. "There's a box canyon ahead," he called to Neal over the thunder of hooves. "We can lose them there." She nodded, trusting him completely. They veered left into a narrow passage between towering rock walls. The passage twisted and turned, barely wide enough for the horses. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. Then they burst into the box canyon, and Elliot's heart sank. It wasn't empty. A camp sprawled across the canyon floor. Tents, wagons, at least 40 people. Apache families who'd fled the reservations, seeking freedom in the wild places. Children played near a stream. Women tended fires. Men worked on weapons and tools. And every single one of them turned to stare at Elliot and Neal as they rode in. An elder stepped forward, his face weathered as the canyon walls. He spoke in Apache. Neal responded, her voice urgent. The conversation went back and forth, rapid and intense. Elliot caught only fragments, seeds, north, soldiers. The elder's eyes narrowed. He looked at Elliot with suspicion bordering on hostility. Then he looked at Neal again, at the deerskin pouch on her chest. His expression changed, softened. He spoke one word that Elliot understood. "Family." Neal's eyes glistened. She nodded. The elder raised his hand, and suddenly the entire camp was in motion. Men grabbed rifles, women gathered children, wagons were positioned across the canyon entrance. In minutes, they'd transformed the camp into a fortress. The elder turned to Elliot and spoke in broken English. "You bring soldiers. You fight with us." It wasn't a question. It was a command. Elliot nodded. "We fight together." The elder's lips curved in a grim smile. "Good, because they are here." The sound of hooves echoed through the canyon passage. Creed's brother was coming, and this time there would be no running, no clever tricks, just a stand in the desert, outnumbered and outgunned. But Elliot Kane had stopped running 8 years ago. The first shot rang out like thunder. Creed's brother rode into the box canyon at the head of his men, expecting to find 2 fugitives cornered and helpless. Instead, he found 40 Apache warriors waiting with rifles raised. The shock on his face lasted only a moment before it twisted into rage. "Kill them all!" he roared. His men charged. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Elliot dove behind a wagon, rifle in hand, picking off soldiers as they poured through the narrow entrance. Beside him, Neal loaded weapons with practiced efficiency, passing them to the Apache fighters. The elder commanded his people with calm authority, directing fire to create a crossfire that turned the canyon entrance into a killing ground. Creed's brother fell back, his men scattering for cover. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "Bring up the cannon!" he shouted. Elliot's blood ran cold. A cannon. They'd brought a damn cannon. Within minutes, it was positioned at the canyon entrance. The barrel swung toward the camp, toward the women and children huddled behind the wagons, toward Neol and the seeds she carried. The elder saw it too. His face remained calm, but Elliot saw the calculation in his eyes. They couldn't stop a cannon. They were finished, unless someone did something insane. Elliot looked at Neol. She looked back at him. Understanding passed between them without words. He'd spent 8 years running from Wolf Pass, from the moment his hesitation cost a boy his life. He wouldn't hesitate again. "Cover me," he said to the elder. Then he was running, sprinting across open ground toward the canyon entrance. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet. He didn't slow down. Behind him, every rifle in the camp opened fire, providing covering fire that forced Creed's men to keep their heads down. Elliot ran like the devil himself was chasing him. The cannon crew saw him coming. They swung the barrel toward him. He dove behind a boulder just as the cannon fired. The shell screamed over his head and exploded against the canyon wall. Rock shattered. Dust filled the air. Elliot's ears rang. But he was alive. And he was close now. So close. He pulled a stick of dynamite from his belt, left over from his mining days, carried out of habit. Lit the fuse with a match struck against the boulder, counted to 3, then stood and threw it with everything he had. The dynamite arced through the air, trailing smoke. It landed directly in the cannon's barrel. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The cannon crew stared at it in horror. Then the dynamite exploded. The cannon burst apart in a spray of metal and fire. The crew was thrown like rag dolls. Creed's brother screamed in rage and desperation. His men broke, started retreating. The Apache fighters surged forward, pressing the advantage. Within minutes, it was over. Creed's brother lay dead, his men scattered or captured. The box canyon fell silent except for the moans of the wounded. Elliot walked back to the camp, his legs trembling with exhaustion. Neal met him halfway. She didn't say anything, just pressed her forehead against his chest for a moment. A quiet acknowledgement of what he'd done, what they'd done together. The elder approached, his weathered face serious. "You are brave, white man," he said in English. "But this will not be the last. More soldiers will come. Many more." Elliot knew he was right. This was just the beginning. The army wouldn't let this stand. They'd send a full regiment if they had to. "Then we need to move faster," Neal said, her voice strong despite the exhaustion in her eyes. Get to the valley before they can organize. The elder nodded slowly. My people will come with you. We will plant these seeds together. What had started as two fugitives fleeing into the desert had become something else entirely. An exodus. A journey toward hope. That night, as the camp packed up under starlight, Elliot stood at the canyon rim, looking north toward the valley that awaited them. Niall joined him, the deerskin pouch still clutched in her hand. Do you think we'll make it? She asked quietly. Elliot thought about Wolf Pass, about the boy who died because of his hesitation, about 8 years of running and hiding and trying to forget, about Creed and his brother and all the violence that had followed them into the desert, about this woman beside him who'd refused to give up, who'd turned a desperate flight into a mission of redemption. Yeah, he said finally, I think we will. Because sometimes the desert doesn't just make you wait. Sometimes it gives you a second chance. They rode north at dawn, 40 Apache families and 2 former fugitives, carrying seeds and hope and the stubborn belief that something new could grow even in the hardest soil. The valley was still 2 days away. The army would be coming. More blood would be spilled before this was over. But Elliot Kane wasn't running anymore, and that made all the difference. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Elliot looked back one last time at the Box Canyon, at the place where he'd finally stopped hesitating, where he'd chosen to act instead of freeze, where the ghost of Wolf Pass had finally been laid to rest. Then he turned his horse north and rode toward whatever came next. If this tale of fire and forgiveness moved you, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories from the wild desert. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, your town, your corner of the world. Let's hear your voice in this wild, wide desert. Because stories like this don't end when the words stop. They live on in the people who hear them, who share them, who carry them forward. Just like those seeds Niall carried. Just like the hope they planted together. The journey isn't over. It's just beginning.